Section 8 of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 8. "But what are you going to do?" she asked him. "Oh, the lawyers and solicitors, Messrs. Hooper and Greatley of Lincoln's Inn, they were going to do it," he said, and he actually pared his nails with his pocket knife. "For heaven's sake, leave your knife alone!" she cried to herself in irrepressible irritation. It was his silly unconventionality, his weakness, his lack of the ghost of a notion what anyone else was feeling that annoyed her, had always annoyed her. And now at his age, how silly! "I know all that," Peter thought. "I know what I'm up against," he thought, running his finger along the blade of his knife. "Clarissa and Dalloway and all the rest of them, but I'll show Clarissa." And then, to his utter surprise, suddenly thrown by those uncontrollable forces thrown through the air, he burst into tears. Wept without the least shame, sitting on the sofa, the tears running down his cheeks. And Clarissa had leant forward, taken his hand, drawn him to her, kissed him, actually had felt his face on hers before she could down the brandishing of silver flashing, plumes like pampas grass in a tropic gale in her breast, which, subsiding, left her holding his hand, patting his knee, and feeling as she sat back extraordinarily at her ease with him and light-hearted, all in a clap it came over her. If I had married him, this gaiety would have been mine all day. It was all over for her. The sheet was stretched and the bed narrow. She had gone up into the tower alone and left them blackberrying in the sun. The door had shut, and there among the dust of fallen plaster and the litter of birds' nests, how distant the view had looked. And the sounds came thin and chill. Once on Leith Hill, she remembered. And Richard, Richard, she cried, as a sleeper in the night starts and stretches a hand in the dark for help. Lunching with Lady Bruton, it came back to her. He has left me. I am alone for ever, she thought, folding her hands upon her knee. Peter Walsh had got up and crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, flicking a bandana handkerchief from side to side. Masterly and dry and desolate he looked, his thin shoulder blades lifting his coat slightly, blowing his nose violently. Take me with you, Clarissa thought impulsively, as if he were starting directly upon some great voyage. And then, next moment, it was as if the 5 acts of a play that had been very exciting and moving were now over, and she had lived a lifetime in them, and had run away, had lived with Peter, and it was now over. Now it was time to move, and as a woman gathers her things together, her cloak, her gloves, her opera glasses, and gets up to go out of the theatre into the street, she rose from the sofa and went to Peter. And it was awfully strange, he thought, how she still had the power, as she came tinkling, rustling, still had the power as she came across the room, to make the moon, which he detested, rise at Burton on the terrace in the summer sky. "Tell me," he said, seizing her by the shoulders, "are you happy, Clarissa? Does Richard—" The door opened. "Here is my Elizabeth," said Clarissa, emotionally, histrionically perhaps. "How do you do?" said Elizabeth, coming forward. The sound of Big Ben striking the half-hour struck out between them with extraordinary vigour, as if a young man, strong, indifferent, inconsiderate, were swinging dumb-bells this way and that. "Hullo, Elizabeth!" cried Peter, stuffing his handkerchief into his pocket, going quickly to her, saying "Good-bye, Clarissa," without looking at her, leaving the room quickly, and running downstairs and opening the hall door. "Peter! Peter!" cried Clarissa, following him out onto the landing. "My party tonight! Remember my party tonight!" she cried, having to raise her voice against the roar of the open air, and overwhelmed by the traffic and the sound of all the clocks striking, her voice crying, "Remember my party tonight!" sounded frail and thin and very far away as Peter Walsh shut the door. "Remember my party. Remember my party," said Peter Walsh as he stepped down the street, speaking to himself rhythmically, in time with the flow of the sound, the direct, downright sound of Big Ben striking the half-hour. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Oh, these parties, he thought. Clarissa's parties. Why does she give these parties, he thought. Not that he blamed her, or this effigy of a man in a tailcoat with a carnation in his buttonhole coming towards him. Only one person in the world could be as he was, in love. And there he was, this fortunate man, himself, reflected in the plate-glass window of a motor-car manufacturer in Victoria Street. All India lay behind him, plains, mountains, epidemics of cholera, a district twice as big as Ireland, decisions he had come to alone. He, Peter Walsh, who was now, really for the first time in his life, in love. Clarissa had grown hard, he thought, and a trifle sentimental into the bargain, he suspected, looking at the great motor cars capable of doing how many miles on how many gallons? For he had a turn for mechanics, had invented a plough in his district, had ordered wheelbarrows from England, but the coolies wouldn't use them, all of which Clarissa knew nothing whatever about. The way she had said, "Here is my Elizabeth," that annoyed him. Why not "Here's Elizabeth," simply? It was insincere, and Elizabeth didn't like it either. Still, the last tremors of the great booming voice shook the air round him. The half-hour, still early, only 11:30 still. For he understood young people, he liked them. There was always something cold in Clarissa, he thought. She had always, even as a girl, a sort of timidity, which in middle age becomes conventionality, and then it's all up, he thought, looking rather drearily into the glassy depths, and wondering whether, by calling at that hour, he had annoyed her, overcome with shame suddenly at having been a fool, wept, been emotional, told her everything as usual. As a cloud crosses the sun, silence falls on London, and falls on the mind. Effort ceases. Time flaps on the mast. There we stop. There we stand. Rigid, the skeleton of habit alone upholds the human frame. Where there is nothing, Peter Walsh said to himself, feeling hollowed out, utterly empty within. Clarissa refused me, he thought. He stood there thinking, Clarissa refused me. "Ah," said St. Margaret, like a hostess who comes into her drawing-room on the very stroke of the hour and finds her guests there already. "I am not late. No, it is precisely 11:30, she says. Yet, though she is perfectly right, her voice, being the voice of the hostess, is reluctant to inflict its individuality. Some grief for the past holds it back, some concern for the present. It is 11:30, she says, and the sound of St. Margaret's glides into the recesses of the heart and buries itself in ring after ring of sound, like something alive which wants to confide itself, to disperse itself, to be, with a tremor of delight, at rest. Like Clarissa herself, thought Peter Walsh, coming down the stairs on the stroke of the hour in white. It is Clarissa herself, he thought, with a deep emotion, and an extraordinarily clear yet puzzling recollection of her, as if this belle had come into the room years ago, where they sat at some moment of great intimacy, and had gone from one to the other and had left, like a bee with honey, laden with the moment. But what room? What moment? And why had he been so profoundly happy when the clock was striking? Then, as the sound of St. Margaret's languished, he thought, she has been ill, and the sound expressed languor and suffering. It was her heart, he remembered, and the sudden loudness of the final stroke told for death that surprised in the midst of life, Clarissa falling where she stood in her drawing-room. "No, no," he cried, "she is not dead. I am not old," he cried, and marched up Whitehall as if there rolled down to him, vigorous, unending, his future. He was not old, or set, or dried in the least. As for caring what they said of him, the Dalloways, the Whitbreads in their set, he cared not a straw, though it was true he would have, some time or other, to see whether Richard couldn't help him to some job. Striding, staring, he glared at the statue of the Duke of Cambridge. He had been sent down from Oxford, true. He had been a socialist, in some sense a failure, true. Still, the future of civilization lies, he thought, in the hands of young men like that, of young men such as he was 30 years ago, with their love of abstract principles, getting books sent out to them all the way from London to a peak in the Himalayas, reading science, reading philosophy. The future lies in the hands of young men like that, he thought. A patter like the patter of leaves in a wood came from behind, and with it a rustling, regular thudding sound, which as it overtook him drummed his thoughts strict in step up Whitehall, without his doing. Boys in uniform, carrying guns, marched with their eyes ahead of them, marched, their arms stiff, and on their faces an expression like the letters of a legend written round the base of a statue praising duty, gratitude, fidelity, love of England. It is, thought Peter Walsh, beginning to keep step with them, a very fine training. But they did not look robust. They were weedy for the most part, boys of 16, who might tomorrow stand behind bowls of rice, cakes of soap on counters. Now they wore on them, unmixed with sensual pleasure or daily preoccupations, the solemnity of the wreath which they had fetched from Finsbury pavement to the empty tomb. They had taken their vow. The traffic respected it. Vans were stopped. I can't keep up with them, Peter Walsh thought, as they marched up Whitehall, and sure enough, on they marched, past him, past everyone, in their steady way, as if one will worked legs and arms uniformly, and life, with its varieties, its irreticences, had been laid under a pavement of monuments and wreaths and drugged into a stiff yet staring corpse by discipline. One had to respect it. One might laugh, but one had to respect it, he thought. There they go, thought Peter Walsh, pausing at the edge of the pavement, and all the exalted statues, Nelson, Gordon, Havelock, the Black, the spectacular images of great soldiers stood looking ahead of them, as if they too had made the same renunciation. Peter Walsh felt he too had made it, the great renunciation, trampled under the same temptations, and achieved at length a marble stare. But the stare Peter Walsh did not want for himself in the least, though he could respect it in others. He could respect it in boys. They don't know the troubles of the flesh yet, he thought, as the marching boys disappeared in the direction of the Strand. All that I've been through, he thought, crossing the road and standing under Gordon's statue. Gordon, whom as a boy he had worshipped. Gordon standing lonely with one leg raised and his arms crossed. Poor Gordon, he thought. And just because nobody yet knew he was in London, except Clarissa, and the earth, after the voyage, still seemed an island to him, the strangeness of standing alone, alive, unknown at 11:30 in Trafalgar Square overcame him. What is it? Where am I? And why, after all, does one do it, he thought, the divorce seeming all moonshine. And down his mind went flat as a marsh, and three great emotions bowled over him: understanding, a vast philanthropy, and finally, as if the result of the others, an irrepressible, exquisite delight, as if inside his brain by another hand strings were pulled, shutters moved, and he, having nothing to do with it, yet stood at the opening of endless avenues, down which if he chose he might wander. He had not felt so young for years. End of Section 8. Read by Hannah Dormer, London, 10th of April, 2021.